Scott, you'll give me the high sign. Herd those cats back in here. We're ready to go? Okay, well, I've already been sort of introduced to you by my friend Michael Myers. My name is Peter Feaver. I'm a professor of political science and public policy here at Duke University, and I'm the director of the Triangle Institute for Security Studies, which is a sister organization to LENS. And I feel like I personify this conference topic in a certain way. I study security studies, and I'm proud to have been born with joint U.S.-Canadian citizenship. My folks are Canadian, all my relatives are Canadian, and I'm the black sheep of the family who is American. Now, I would love to spend some time spanking the previous panel for having poached on our territory, because we are supposed to do missile defense and y'all strayed into it. But I understand that missile defense to the U.S.-Canadian relationship is a little bit like Iraq to discussions about American foreign policy. You always end up there wherever you start. The premise, before I introduce the panel, I just wanted to describe a little bit about the premise of our panel, which is that the issue is not going to go away. It wasn't invented with the Supreme Court decision awarding the presidency to George Bush. It preceded that when I was on the Clinton National Security Council staff. I can remember vividly describing, planning out the glide slope for breaking the ABM treaty, and in a Clintonian move, we decided to push that threshold just a little bit beyond the 2000 election, but we knew we were on that glide slope. We put that in place. It's an issue that, contrary to the implications you got from Steve Staples, is extremely democratic. It's very popular in the United States. The polling data is remarkable in this. There was just a poll put out by PIPA, which is a polling service based in Maryland, and they used a wording designed to depress support for missile defense. The wording is, with regard to missile defense, do you think the U.S. should build a missile defense system right away, or do more research until such a system is proven to be effective, or not build a missile defense system at all? That middle option, of course, is worded in such a way so that everyone would pick that, because if you were arguing to build a missile defense system, you're saying, oh yeah, I want to build an ineffective one now, rather than research and wait until it's effective. This is called push polling in the business. That push poll, when it was done in June 2002, got almost a third of the public basically endorsing build a system right now that your poll in question tells us is not going to be effective. So that's a third for that, and then 55% doing the R&D option, which of course would put us on the slope to building it, and only 14% not at all. They just asked that again in April, just a few weeks ago, and the answer they got is down to a fifth. So 21% in the immediate deployment, 68% in the research option, only 8% saying not at all. That 8%, if you understand American public opinion, I'm in the polling business myself, when you get numbers like 8%, that's lower than the number of Americans who think that Elvis Presley is the leader of Canada. There's very little public support for stopping missile defense in the U.S. This is at the general public level. Of course, at the elite level, if you were to poll the average faculty club, you would get a very different result. We also know, of course, that this administration is committed to it. It's now common knowledge that Condi Rice was teeing up to give a major speech on the national security priorities of the Bush administration on September 11th. She was headed over to Johns Hopkins to do that when the terrorists struck. Obviously, she didn't give that speech. That speech has not yet been given, but missile defense remains a major priority of this administration, and so it is not going away in the U.S.-Canadian relationship either, which is why we pulled together this panel. We have a very distinguished panel, and I'll just introduce them briefly in the order to which they'll speak, and then we'll just run down. Our first speaker is going to be the Honorable Premier Paul Okalik, who will present a perspective that is almost never heard in the United States. And so this is a wonderful opportunity for the Americans in the audience to listen to it. He is the premier and also holds the portfolio of executive and intergovernmental affairs and justice of Nunavut. And he will be speaking to us from that sort of ground-eye perspective. The Americans support missile defense in part because they like the idea of where they think the missiles will be intercepted and land. And it'll be interesting to hear from the point of view of someone on whom they might land. And then we will hear from Don MacNamara, who is a specialist in national and international security affairs and strategic analysis. He had a long and distinguished career in the Canadian Armed Forces, and then joined the faculty of Queen's University of Business in 1988. We heard a little bit of his preview, a teaser of his remarks in the previous panel. Then we'll hear from the very distinguished Dr. Polanyi, who, as we all know, is the Nobel Prize winner in chemistry in 1986. He will not be speaking to us from his field of specialty. I hope he will be speaking to us from his long and distinguished career as an expert on national security affairs, arms control, and in particular as an ardent opponent of missile defense. And then batting cleanup, the One America. This is what passes for balance on this issue. Is one American, Professor Tom Nichols, who's the chairman of the Department of Strategy, Policy, and holds the Forrest Sherman Chair of Public Diplomacy at the Naval War College. He holds a PhD from Georgetown University and is a distinguished author on a variety of national security topics, including civil-military relations, which of course makes him the absolute queen of the field. That's what I do. That's sort of the epicenter of all studies of security studies, but also has written widely on national security affairs. So without further ado, I'll ask the Premier to come and start us off.
Thank you, Peter. Good day. Let me begin by thanking and recognizing the long-standing work of Duke University in promoting greater understanding between Canada and the United States. It is my hope that by including the perspective of Nunavut, we can increase cooperation and the small but valued trade that exists between our jurisdictions. In some ways, the view of Canada, held by many Americans, is much like the view of Nunavut, held by too many Canadians. In both cases, there's a perception of a cold, faraway land where people live in igloos. Of course, we know that this isn't true. Southern Canadians don't have the technical know-how to build igloos. While I joke about technology, it is one of the issues that I would like to address today. This panel has debated the national and international repercussions of the ballistic missile defense. For Nunavut, BMD has the potential to become a real local issue. I want to discuss with you the historical and unintended consequences of these sorts of projects on Inuit. I also want to focus on how we are now in a better position to mitigate negative impacts and partner in new possibilities. When I first received the invitation for this conference, I was intrigued by the theme of U.S.-Canadian security relations, partnership or predicament. For Inuit, our contact with the outside world has always been both. As waves of interest have washed up on our shores, we have greeted each advance with cautious optimism. We are a culture that is open to change, while simultaneously holding dear our customs and traditions. This openness is about to be tested again. All indications point to the growing interest in the circumpolar world. A few summers back, a Chinese government research vessel showed up on the shores of Tuktoyaktuk in the Western Arctic. They beat a hasty retreat when confronted by the local police, but the Chinese have since opened up their own Arctic Research Institute in northern Sweden. Our Russian neighbors have stepped up their Arctic oil exploration and are encroaching on Canadian territory. The Danes are hoisting their flag alongside the coast of Nunavut. And of course, there's also the United States. Twice, this country has publicly broken into the Northwest Passage with reinforced vessels. There are the regular submarine traverses into the polar ice cap. I'm glad to see that, as in the past, Canada has sent in the police, soldiers, and administrators to affirm our territorial sovereignty. Ottawa has again taken notice of those who deny our historical claim to the Arctic, its coasts, and its waterways. Yesterday, an expedition of Canadian soldiers and Inuit rangers completed an 18-day, 1,300-kilometer snowmobile reconnaissance of Nunavut's high Arctic. Departing from Resolute, they crossed Evan Island and the entrance of the Northwest Passage and continued on to Alert. This sovereignty of patrol marks the beginning of a stepped-up Canadian presence in the high Arctic. This summer, the Canadian military will deploy 2 companies of the 2nd Battalion, Royal Canadian Regiment, along with the patrol frigate HMCS Montreal and her crew for exercise on Baffin Island. There will also be testing of an unmanned aerial vehicles, a new satellite surveillance system, and plans for building a permanent high-frequency surface wave radar installations to warn of unauthorized passing in the Northwest Passage. But Canada's most dramatic move to reinforce its claim in the Arctic occurred when it signed the Nunavut Land Claim Agreement with Inuit. The continuous use, occupation, and defense of our territory is indisputable. With our signature on the agreement that created Nunavut, we delivered to Canada our unbroken and unchallenged proprietorship of the Eastern Arctic. And while Nunavut literally means our land in Inuit, our language, there's also the Inuit tradition of openness and adaptability to those who have come to our shores with goods and technologies from the outside world. Our treaty with Canada has codified in modern terms this ancient tradition. Our ability to survive and prosper in a land that was inaccessible and inhospitable to the outside world has meant that visitors to present-day Nunavut have always sought partnership with Inuit in order to survive. We've always received visitors and shared with them our knowledge of our land and our environment. In return, we learned of customs and technologies used in other cultures and adopted them to suit our own needs. Today in Nunavut, snow machines are used alongside our dog teams. Handheld GPS locators are tucked inside traditional caribou parkas. The glow of computer screens compete with the lights of our oil lamps. For Inuit, outside interest in exploring our world has always been an opportunity for us to share and to make our contribution to the collective wisdom of humankind. Informally, this could be called sharing. In a more formal sense, this is called technology transfer and capacity building. From the explorers and whalers to the missionaries and scientists, we have exchanged knowledge and we have built relationships. The continuum of outside interest in the Arctic has always turned on the question of strategic interests, be they commercial, religious, or military. All those forces are still in play today. The quest for the Northwest Passage, centuries ago, drew Europeans into the heart of our territory, is once again a vital question because of changing climatic conditions. Missionaries, particularly those associated with the evangelical Christian movement, found here in the southern United States, are quite active in the Arctic. The whalers and fur traders of yesterday have been replaced by geologists of today. And now we have a proposal to update the Cold War era radar installations of the Distant Early Warning System with ballistic missile defense. The analysis of the benefits, risks, and advisability of DMD is not a question of our government. Our national government and the international community are already stating out national positions. What is the question for us is the impact that this or any other national or international project has on Nunavut. For us, this is the question that defines our partnership and our predicament. It is here where we must examine past practices and future requirements. It is instructive to look at the legacy of the American government's involvement in the Eastern Arctic. The U.S. government presence in the Eastern and Central Arctic was spearheaded by the military during World War II. Our capital, Okalik, was originally built with U.S. dollars. Though it has expanded since the U.S. service personnel left in 1963, much of the original infrastructure is still in place today and greatly appreciated. Our attachment to that period of American investment is reflected in our daily use of the military camp designations in the areas of our capital, such as Lower Base, Upper Base, the West 40, and the North Pole. Airstrips that encourage community growth were built across our territory. Post-war weather stations that were the precursors to the new land sites fundamentally changed the demographics and the migration patterns of Inuit. The Dew Line, with its radar installations stretching from Alaska, across Canada, Greenland, and Iceland, had along its own time zone, its own charter service that moved Inuit employees and their families from one region to the next. Families would arrive without established travel lines or local hunting knowledge, and would instead grow dependent on their military remuneration, which included not only wages but also food box and housing. For many, this was considered a luxury, but we must also recognize how this changed family structures, language, and traditional ties to the land. For just as there are positive stories about our new opportunities, there are examples where the clash of our cultures and our values have not gone well. Just as communities were built around new technologies and infrastructure, this same process destroyed other communities. In some cases, the lasting effects of the previous military projects were based on the ignorance of the day. PCBs and other persistent organic pollutants were not well known 50 years ago today. To this day, many of the Dew Line buildings have PCB-enforced paint, making them difficult to dispose of. In other cases, damage that was left behind might have been mitigated with more robust public interest perspectives. Initially, there were very few Canadian government observers at the U.S. military sites, and though Inuit were all at all times employed, we certainly weren't given the authority to manage the downstream effects of these projects. With the support of the Canadian government and an earlier payment of the U.S. government, there is a program of site reclamation of military sites in Nunavut and across the Canadian North. The Nunavut Agreement and our government are now in place to ensure that future development projects take into consideration the potentially positive and negative impacts of such projects in our territory. We don't have the jurisdiction of the federal government to decide on matters of national and international security. What we are seeking is a positive role in projects that are undertaken in our home. Just as we have shared our traditional knowledge of the Arctic, we are looking to learn from those who bring new technologies to our land. In the past, we served military projects as guides, cooks, and cleaners. In the future, we can put our traditional knowledge to use in a modern context. we knew we'd have a role to play in northern projects that require an understanding of the Arctic when it comes to such fields as engineering, climatology, and environmental assessment. What we want is a partnership, so that the predicaments of the past are transformed into possibilities for our future. William, thank you.
Well, first of all, like many others, I would like to thank the organizers of this program, Scott and Michael, for inviting me to be here, and in particular for placing me on such a distinguished panel, which I feel totally inadequate. I also would like to thank General Rees for his tremendous speech last night, which took some of the pressure off my own talk today, which I will not repeat many of the things that I had intended to say that he had said last night in terms of the historic relationship. Also, I am filled with admiration because this is the first conference that I have been at in my career when two MacNamaras have been on the same bill. So thank you very much, organizers. That's a great opportunity. Premier Okalik, I would just like to second all your remarks about the Canadian North, which I have been privileged to travel through extensively over the years. There are indeed very few people in the South that know how to build an igloo. But one of the things that, particularly in the Air Force and the Army, the instruction on how to build an igloo was given, and very much during the 50s and 60s. It was a matter of survival that you knew how to build an igloo. And every once in a while, and we've suffered a rather severe winter in Kingston this year, much to my surprise, did much of an igloo appear on our waterfront, very well constructed according to the principles that I had been taught. So it's a very rare art, but it's not totally absent in the South. And I'd like to reassure you that if you need any help, there are a few of us that would like to go out and practice our skills.
I'd like to see you all build one down here in North Carolina. That would impress me.
No, you wouldn't, because of the weather and in the circumstances you would not go out. In any event, we're here to talk about the issue of ballistic missile defense. And ballistic missile defense is, for Canada, a matter of defense and security and sovereignty. I'd like to address each of those very briefly. First of all, in terms of defense, it remains a vital interest in Canada, in common with the United States, to prevent any attack on Canadian territory, and especially a nuclear attack. Now, for over 50 years, Canada has recognized this vital interest and has responded by contributing to NATO through our deterrent forces in Europe, and to the protection of our national air and sea approaches through air defense and anti-submarine forces in Canada, as well as contributing to the protection of the United States deterrent forces through NORAD, using our surveillance, early warning, air defense, and interception systems on Canadian territory, including the forward operating bases in the north the Premier referred to, for both air defense and strategic attack bombers. Now, additionally, and this was mentioned in the previous panel, Canada's peacekeeping efforts throughout the Cold War really contributed to defending that vital interest. And I'd like to just expand on that for a moment, because when I talk about, referred in my own remarks about peacekeeping being a myth, what many people do not realize is that Canada became involved in peacekeeping as a reflection of its vital interest. Its vital interest was to prevent a nuclear war between the superpowers, the only thing that could destroy Canada. Our capability, whether it's in air defense or contributing air and land forces to the deterrent NATO forces, was very, very limited. And our major concern was that regional conflicts could escalate along east-west grounds to lead to a confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States, resulting in a nuclear war that could destroy Canada. So the prevention of escalation of conflict became a vital interest to Canada, and hence our need to participate in peacekeeping to prevent that escalation. And I can tell you from personal experience, having been a staff officer involved in contributing to those decisions, this was the first consideration at the first word of a local engagement occurring. Anyway, overall, through the combination of our defense and deterrent forces and our peacekeeping activities, this multifaceted approach to the defense of Canada has been a consistent and historic component of Canadian defense policy. Now, the current foreseen threat of a nuclear attack by a ballistic or cruise missile is indeed limited to very, very few states, and potentially also to these non-state organizations, or some of the people we now call terrorists, capable of different levels and kinds of asymmetric operations. And we cannot exclude the possibility of there, in the not too distant future, having the capability to use both nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. Now, the fact that the threat appears limited doesn't make it any less serious. So it therefore continues to be in Canada's direct, vital, national and defense interest to be part of any system aimed at neutralizing even a limited attack on North America. Now, the impact of such an attack or event, or even its possibility, is also a national security interest in the broadest sense. Neither Canada nor the United States can permit or accept the possibility or probability that a single nuclear weapon can land in North America, especially in any urban area. The economic, political, social, and psychological costs of such an event are and would be unacceptable. There is a clear lesson from 9/11 in this regard, in that the scope, the impact, and trickle-down of the direct and indirect costs of that attack on the United States and Canada have been incalculable, hundreds of billions of dollars. And every Canadian, as well as every American, is paying more in their insurance policies for their homes and cars because of the cost of that event. So we have to recognize these trickle-down effects as being the potential fallout of such an attack. The border security issues that have been discussed elsewhere in this meeting only reinforce our common interests in recognizing that our border is, in geographic terms, artificial. Any off-course or shortfall weapon aimed at the United States will not automatically self-destruct because it approaches Canadian territory. We must recognize that we are in this together. A trans-Pacific polar missile trajectory aimed at Chicago or New York could easily end up hitting Winnipeg or Toronto. And given the potential imperfections of these terrorist organizations, they wouldn't care if they got to Winnipeg or Toronto instead of Chicago or New York. So whether involved in the construction, the deployment, or the control of a BMD system or not, Canada could well be an unintended target. It also could be an intended target. So it's also essential in terms of Canadian sovereignty to contribute to the defense of North America, and that would be indeed historically consistent. For Canada to fail to take advantage of its own geography or to contribute to the quality and effectiveness of the technology and the defense systems would, in effect, result in a loss of sovereign decision-making on what defense against ballistic missiles may be undertaken in North America. The concept of perimeter defense of North America in the sense of ballistic missile defense makes eminent sense. Now, notwithstanding a criticism sometimes loud, sometimes soft, of the capability of the proposed system, the limited deployment of a limited system also provides Canada, if part of the organization, with an opportunity to participate in and contribute to the ongoing development of the technology as it matures. Outside such decision-making could well leave Canada isolated and vulnerable if the United States were to adopt a system that satisfied their interests alone. And that is certainly the direction that they would appear to be going. It is probably unrealistic for Canada and Canadians to think that we may have any effective veto on U.S. deployment plans. However, without participation to the greatest degree possible, consistent with our interests and capabilities, we can be certain of having no voice or impact at all. There will be financial costs, but as Vijay had mentioned, the costs at this stage of the game appear to be minimal. However, Canada's per capita defense costs are now only 1/5 of those of the United States, and 1/3 as a percentage of GDP, whatever numbers you'd like to use, Steve. Now, failure to cooperate and participate could result in devastating changes in the Canada-US economic and other relationships, which could make defense costs seem minuscule by comparison. The state's concerns that security trumps trade. I think the equation that generally is seen to be operating these days, security comes first, which allows economic development, which allows social development, which is what everybody is aiming at. But without security, the economic and social programs are unlikely to follow. So arguments from Canada that attempt to discredit the U.S. threat perception or the feasibility of the technologies are really seen as none of Canada's business unless there is some implicit intent to cooperate in this latest continental defense effort. So unless we're there, we're not really in a position to comment or criticize. Now, through participation with the United States in the ballistic missile defense system assessment and deployment decisions, and deployment should it occur, Canada's interests could be better served while also reducing risk to Canadians. It would also reinforce to the U.S., responsible for about 7% of our exports, which represents about 36% of our GDP, that we do wish to contribute to continental security, as well as to continue to receive the benefits from a booming U.S. economy. There's an additional sovereignty issue often forgotten, perhaps not even understood by most Canadians. Our existing capability for the surveillance of our own territory is very much dependent on the space-based sensor systems of the United States. Our historical involvement in NORAD has provided us special access to such information. Were Canada not to participate further in the continental attack warning and assessment and air defense and ballistic missile defense programs, we could most likely lose access to such vital information. To have our neighbor knowing about activity in and around our territory and us not would be a clear loss of sovereignty. Hence, without participation, Canada would not have either the information about what is going on in and over its own territory or the capability to obtain it. Both the exposure to risk and loss of surveillance information represent serious threats to and losses of Canadian sovereignty. Finally, to wrap up, were a Canadian government to fail to take whatever measures possible to deter, disrupt, or destroy a ballistic missile attack that could even threaten Canada with a single missile, such calculated irresponsibility to protect Canada's vital interest would be seen to be the ultimate and historic failure in sovereignty, defense, and security decision-making.
Well, I too am delighted to be here, grateful to Professor Silliman and Byers for putting together fascinating program and a well-balanced bunch of panels. I get up to disagree at many points with my colleague. I certainly agree that two MacNamaras are better than one, and indeed I would prefer to have a third Robert MacNamara here, who has become an apostle for arms control, which I think is an issue that needs to be brought into this debate. As you've heard, I'm a scientist. I was recruited really for this sort of discussion 40 years ago by people older than myself who had been present in the desert of Alamogordo when the first nuclear weapon, a mere atom bomb, was exploded. Their lives were transformed by the science and the horror of that explosion, which by contemporary terms was a modest-sized nuclear weapon. I would stress even more strongly than it is Don MacNamara that the explosion of one such weapon on the territory of the United States or of Canada would be a tragedy beyond anything that history has known. The question is, how do we prevent such a thing from happening? I have, as I am hinting, been a part of the debate and a watcher of missile defense through actually 4 previous phases. This is the 5th. The first one was Nike Zeus in the 1960s. Then came Sentinel, again the white hope of those who hoped to interpose some sort of screen between this horrible danger and us. After Sentinel came Safeguard. After Safeguard came Star Wars. I was very much involved in that debate. And now, oh gosh, and now we have the 5th attempt to construct such a shield with a background such as the one I've just described. I am a skeptic. I have been a little involved in the technology by the sort of irony that happens to scientists. I actually provided from my laboratory the first line of defense for Star Wars, something called a chemical laser. Wasn't my intent, but these things happen. And so I watch the technology. I'm aware that in the present phase, which until now has been one of research and development, and one cannot sensibly oppose research and development. I agree with the 70% of the people who voted for it. What one can oppose is premature and hasty deployment, which is what is now in the offing for October of 2004. And the question at issue here, I think, is what is the thinking in Canada on this subject? Is there a body of opinion that is respectable that would want to hold back from a vote of confidence for the deployment, which is projected for only a few months from now? And I'm going to suggest to you that there is such a body of opinion, and that it is a respectable one, and that one should be understanding of the fact that there will be a strong attempt to hold Canada back from giving the vote of confidence that some in the United States would like to see Canada give. As for the technology of the present system, I'm not going to discuss the nuts and bolts of it. I would just mention that every test that has been made of it has provided the interceptor not only with the knowledge of where the incoming missile was coming from and when it was fired, but also with the information from a global positioning beacon mounted on the nose of the incoming missile saying, "Here I am, hit me." And that, of course, is not something that would happen in the real world. Even so, the interception has, of course, been less than 100% successful. Nobody would expect that now or at any time in the future. We've spent this meeting talking about the real world and I think, bears on this missile defense question what sort of priority should be given to a porous, expensive missile defense system. Investigate it, yes. Deploy it, I would say no. The world that I've heard discussed here is a world where we need to build up international law. It's absolutely vital if we're going to cohabit in this single globe. We need to be cognizant of the fact that there are forces that are opposed to international law. There's thinking in this country that's opposed to it, but I'm thinking of something else, which is the wrecking forces of terrorism, the fact that power is devolving to lower and lower levels, larger and larger power is doing so. And what are those people saying? In Canada, they are interpreted not as being people who are saying so much that we hate freedom or we hate you, but more we are now part of the enfranchised, we have rights, we in fact envy you, and of course that is no reason for killing. But the tape of Osama bin Laden that struck home, at least in my mind, was the one in which he said, addressing this continent, addressing you and addressing me, why should you, the wealthy, have the monopoly of security and the monopoly of prosperity? That is the real driving force, and it really is the place that we should be placing our efforts and resources in international law and in building up a more equitable world system. Let's turn now specifically to missile defense in the few minutes I have. This present deployment is being rationalized in a somewhat new way. I think by certain fantasies. One fantasy is that a rogue state which cannot be deterred by the certain knowledge that that state would be committing suicide by attacking a major nuclear power such as this one, that would not be deterred by that knowledge, would somehow hold back knowing that a partial defense exists. I don't see the force of that argument. There is a second argument that's floating around, and that is that the President of the United States has heavy responsibilities and should be enabled to resist nuclear blackmail. And would he not be in a better position to resist nuclear blackmail, let's say on the part of North Korea, if there were a partial defense deployed? I had a comment on that from Joe Biden, who sits on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee here. He said, well, under those circumstances, the President would be able to say to himself, I don't need to back down, because if they attack, I shall only lose Los Angeles and Chicago. I don't have to dwell on the irony and ridiculousness of that. Missile defense is a gesture, I think, and it can be conceived of as a humane gesture because it says the people of, let's say, this country and the people of Canada are entitled to be defended. Now, we know that they will be defended from a very small percentage of the nuclear threat, namely intercontinental ballistic missiles, and I won't go through a catalogue of other means of delivery of weapons of mass destruction. It doesn't seem that outweighs the factors that I'm just going to bring to the fore. I think, in fact, as a gesture, it is a very unfortunate one because it says to the public, we do not think that you are capable of recognizing the modern world for what it is. Don MacNamara was saying that we cannot accept a situation where a single nuclear weapon could be delivered to this continent. But I would say The exact opposite, that we have to accept such a situation because there is no way of escaping it. We have to build a world where that eventuality is as small as possible, and we will not do so by building any sort of fortress that I, as a scientist, can conceive of. What about the issues being kicked around in Canada on this question? Let me quickly run down the list. One item obviously high on the list is that we want to be good neighbors to the United States. That noble sentiment is diluted by the aside that the United States is going to go ahead with missile defense anyway, so why don't we at least pretend to be good neighbors and say yes to missile defense? The United States only wants from us our moral support. Well, I feel that in doing so, Canada would be betraying something that is very important to Canada, and therefore I think also very important to this country, which is our prime devotion to the notion that it is not further technology that will bring lasting peace. It is international law, the subject of this meeting. It is arms control. It is precisely the sort of agreement that sadly was abrogated 2 years ago, the ABM Treaty. The second item, and you've just heard it from Don MacNamara, is that Canada should assert its sovereignty by participating. That seems to me a rather bizarre argument that this is an inevitable step by the United States, so we will assert our sovereignty by acquiescing in it. That does not correspond to my definition of sovereignty. The tangible point which has been raised, and again by Don MacNamara as well as by others, is that we do have an existing security agreement with the United States. It's called NORAD, and we should treasure it, and I agree that we should treasure it. But it deals with air defense. If it's one half as important as people say it is, it will survive the fact that we do not add to it the joint command of missile defense. Finally, there is an element of the debate in Canada. I think Don MacNamara may have mentioned it. It's very important and it's very interesting to this group here. Namely, that in Canada there is an extreme sensitivity to the fact that the last common that humankind has, which has not been weaponized, is outer space. Every political party in Canada is in agreement that were the missile defense layered system to lead to weapons placed in space, we would say no, we would back out. My response is that we should not accept an invitation to dinner with the understanding that we may leave after the hors d'oeuvre. This weaponization of space element is a very important one. Missiles spend most of their trajectory in space. Missiles are going to be intercepted in space. That's what this missile defense system consists of. Mid-course interception. The possibility that somebody will want to not only intercept a missile flying through space and intercept it in space, but intercept it from space seems to me to be high. I perhaps haven't given sufficient weight to the point that Don MacNamara eloquently underscored. Canada should be at the table where missile defense is being discussed. I don't put weight on it myself because seeing the tremendous technological undertaking here, perhaps the greatest ever undertaken by human beings, if you want to really try to intercept ICBMs coming from heaven knows where, there is not flexibility there to say we will not route the defense over Canada because Canadians are sitting at the table contributing incidentally next to nothing in terms of cash. So I think that's a chimera. There is a table we should be sitting at, and maybe I'll just throw that out as my last remark. It's a table we should be sitting at with everybody here, and it is a table at which we need to discuss globally multilaterally, what is the future for missile defense? What, as it is imitated elsewhere, what are the costs likely to be? What are we going to have to neglect in order to try to build up ever-increasing systems of that sort? What is it going to do to stability? What is it going to do to crisis stability? These are questions we should be discussing, not in pairs, and all discussion until now between the US and others has been bilateral. We need a multilateral debate on the long-range future of missile defense. And with that, I end. Thank you for your attention.
I will fire a shot across Tom's bow and observe that the three Canadians hewed exactly to their time limit, which was a remarkable precedent that Americans rarely meet.
Well, in typical American fashion, I'll not abrogate my agreement with Canadians if I can help it, but I obviously don't share. Actually, it's a little intimidating to follow John Polanyi. I should admit that I was a chemistry major for a good 30, 40 minutes. I enjoyed it. I did get a 5 on the AP exam, John, so now that I've established my scientific bona fides. I don't share John's optimism that we're going to placate people like Osama bin Laden with schemes of general security. I think part of what drives a lot of Americans, particularly me, and I should say at this point, I should issue a disclaimer, I'm not speaking for the United States government in my capacity as an academic, is the sense that people like Osama bin Laden are essentially barbarians, and we're not going to reach those kinds of agreements with them, and therefore our security dilemma is something that we have to consider its own merits. I want to apologize if I end up repeating anything that was said this morning. I was editing my remarks in the last minute and I didn't get the word that the NORAD interoperability panel was actually Missile Defense 1. But I want to, before I begin, I want to make a comment on a few things Peter said as well. And John had made reference to, this is the 5th attempt to go ahead with this. I think it's really important to point out that this is an ongoing attempt that has kind of fits its start since the 70s, but certainly since the 80s. When I worked in government on Capitol Hill, it was understood that we were moving this direction. Les Aspin at one point in 1993 tried to declare the era of missile defense over, and we merrily went about going right back to looking at missile defenses. And as Peter's pointed out, we were on a glide slope to get rid of the ABM Treaty even during the Clinton administration. So the idea that this is a new or radical departure from previous American policy is simply, in my view, not a supportable position. Some of the opposition that I think is generated by missile defense, I want to give you the words of one of my colleagues who thinks, one of my American colleagues who thinks the whole idea is so much hooey, because he thinks the whole nuclear enterprise, especially in the wake of the Cold War, is just so much hooey. His ongoing comment is nuclear weapons are like civil servants. They don't work and you can't fire them. So I want to take a page from Michael Howard, who some years ago when asked to comment on a kind of third world war scenario, said, you know, every time I'm presented with these scenarios, I always ask myself, what is this war about? Why is this happening? Why are the tanks rolling through the Fulda Gap? Is this the famous, Hamburg grab, where the Soviets are going to take a piece of territory, or has Germany gone nuclear, or was there some far-off conflict somewhere? What's engendering this? So before I get to some of my more specific arguments, I want to step back and give you some sense of what I think a ballistic missile defense is about. Because so far, I think a lot of the conversation has been in a vacuum. I think John got to some scenarios about this, but I'd like to give you some of my own. First, I think it's very clear what a missile defense system is not. And that is, it's not something that's aimed at the Russian Federation in the replication of a bilateral Cold War relationship. And I think that's one of the reasons. People have been mystified. Gee, why don't the Russians seem to care about this? Well, for a very good reason. The Russians don't need to care about this. They can overcome it. Technologically, at this point, it doesn't threaten their deterrent. And they know for whatever noises they may make, I mean, my Russian colleagues tend to be pretty clear. They know it's not something that's aimed at them. It's probably not even something that is a consideration with China right now, especially at this limited stage. The point of this, in my view, again, I think this is a general approach. People think about missile defense. It's not to recreate some kind of Reagan-esque peace shield where missiles sort of bounce off a big Teflon dome over North America. Rather, there's a deterrent element to ballistic missile defense, particularly for a small N small number nuclear force, and that is to put a defense in place that will induce at least one more minute of uncertainty in the mind of an attacker. Just one. And how much is that worth? That's really the question. How much is one more hour of deliberation or one more minute of uncertainty in the mind of an aggressor with a nuclear missile force by looking and saying, you know, I don't have a whole lot of these things. Because if someone's got 200 or 300 and they're going to launch against the United States, we're in a different situation than missile defense. That's the end of civilization as we know it. And I'll just issue a personal disclaimer here. I don't believe in limited nuclear scenarios. I think if you have that big a force and you fire it. I've never really believed that the Americans or the Soviets, for that matter, were going to sit around, take 80 million casualties and say, well, thank God they were just aiming for our electrical grid. Let's wait it out and see if we can hit their ports. I mean, once these things go into the air, they're all gone. But with a small missile force where an aggressor can say, well, I have 10 of these things. You know, if I'm going to roll the dice and take my shot, I better get real good at it. And I take the point about who would be irrational enough to do that. Well, I think what we're seeing is, I mean, really, you know, who'd fly airplanes into a skyscraper? Really, that's crazy, isn't it? I would also point out, for example, there were cases, Libya in 1990, Muammar Gaddafi, who has since gotten religion and seen the light, said, when talking about the 1986 strike on Tripoli, he said, how could we have prevented this? He said, and I quote, if we had had missiles that could reach New York, we would have launched them at that moment, and therefore we must get these kinds of weapons. There's one guy. I also think that there are other states who could maneuver themselves, or non-state actors could maneuver themselves into a position where they may feel they're going down, and what they really want to do is to take as many Americans, Europeans, Israelis, whoever, down with them before they go. And I don't think that that's a far-fetched or bizarre scenario in any way at all. I think that dismissing the rogue state threat or non-state actor threat as simply irrational places an immense faith in rationality, particularly given that you're dealing with people who do not seem to share our particular value structure and are willing to engage in crazy, in my opinion, just crazy risk. This came up with Saddam Hussein. People say, well, Saddam Hussein, look at Saddam Hussein. He's obviously not a gambler, right? He stayed in power. To which my answer was, look, if you go to a casino with a mortgage and put it all on black and win, that doesn't make you a smart gambler. It makes you lucky. To me, anybody who launches missiles at Israel in the middle of a war is not someone who is taking prudent risks. To me, that was a unbelievably huge throw of the dice, and I think that's a lot of his personality. That's why I think he was someone who essentially was undeterrable in the long run, especially if he got the weapons that he wanted. I want to say a word about technological objections as well. The technological issue here that strikes me is that nuclear bombs were invented when airplanes had propellers. Missiles and nuclear missiles were invented when Howdy Doody was still on television. This is not new technology. It's going to spread. We can talk about non-proliferation regimes and international law and international agreements and inspection regimes. It's going to spread. It is not reversible. That genie is out of the bottle. Now we can try and slow it. We can try and engage in multilateral and international legal attempts to prevent this problem from metastasizing, but it's here and we're going to have to live with it. And this is just one piece. To me, ballistic missile defense is just one piece of the puzzle of how we try to slow this process. To me, when we talk about the weaponization of space, I've never understood that term. On a personal level, I've always felt that space has been weaponized ever since we figured out that we could shoot weapons through space to land on each other, to put military satellites near to watch each other. The weaponization of space, to me, is a relatively empty phrase. Now, in terms of the specific issue of ballistic missile defense in Canada, on one hand I'm surprised, on the other hand I'm not. This should have been an easy decision, as everyone here has pointed out, and as the general pointed out last night, discussions that we've all had throughout the building, this is something that's going to happen. The ballistic missile defense, in some form, is going to move forward. By the way, the poll that Peter brought up, I don't want to play dueling polls with you Peter, because you're the expert on this, but there was a poll that I saw I thought had an even more interesting spin on it some years earlier. It asked Americans whether or not they thought we had a ballistic missile defense. A majority of Americans thought we already had one, and were angry to find out that we didn't. And so when you look at the American political scene and say, well, the president ran on this crazy platform of putting in ballistic missile defenses. That's because the majority of the American people, the biggest thing that's angering them is to find out there wasn't one up there already. So this issue is not going anywhere. Now, I think in theory it should have been easy for Canada.
Reagan was surprised too. So.
Pardon?
Reagan was surprised.
Reagan was a little more astute. I mean, at one point he agreed with Gorbachev at Reykjavik to denuclearize the world, which of course gave George Shultz conniption. We got to call Margaret Thatcher before we do that. And John Poindexter said, one of my favorite Reagan moments, John Poindexter said, "Mr. President, you couldn't have agreed to that." And Reagan turned to him and said, "John, I was there, and I did." So the old guy was a little sharper than people gave him credit for sometimes. Now, I think that if Canada demurs on this, there are going to be substantial changes to NORAD, and I think they'd be dramatic changes in ways that would probably be less of a problem for America than for the Canadians. Again, I don't want to run over some of the points that Don brought up, but I think he spoke to it fairly well. I also don't place much stock in sort of third way, dual hat, double telephone bank kind of solutions. I think in the end, the decision that's going to have to be made is that Canada's probably going to be all the way in or all the way out. I think that the middle solutions, the third way solutions, are probably too complicated and unworkable. Now, it seems to me, as an American observer, looking at it from the shores of Narragansett Bay down here, it seems to me the Canadian government pretty much understands this. The real question, I want to look at this, I do hold a chair in public diplomacy, so I want to look at this from a public diplomacy angle. The real issue for me is, why is the Canadian public divided about this, and why does this seem to be engendering such strong feelings, especially for something that is so not an issue, except in faculty lounges, perhaps, here in the United States. And I want to suggest to you that I think ballistic missile defense is one of the many issues that is really a stalking horse for other, almost more psychological issues in the Canadian-American relationship. I think that this is symbolic and is really revealing some important fault lines. And Lloyd Axworthy started talking about these kind of fault lines and values yesterday that I unfortunately find myself agreeing with more than I want to. It does raise the issue, I think, for example, among a segment of some Canadians, and again, this is from a Southern observer, reading, watching your debates and following your press and the like, who see association of any kind, particularly military association with the United States, as dangerous. That getting involved with this will make Canada a target somehow in a way that it's not. I've had a few interesting sort of moments with Canadian friends who say, "You don't understand, the world loves us. Because we love the UN, and the UN loves us back." And it's not, and this actually got some spin on it after 9/11 that I found very disturbing. I think there was a segment of public opinion in Canada and the United States, in Europe, after 9/11 that said, hey, this isn't about, now again, no one's impugning the reaction of NATO to 9/11, but I think there was a substantial stratum of public opinion, again, I'm speaking at the level of public diplomacy, that said, you know what, this really isn't about us. This is between these fanatics and the Americans, and it's clearly because of things the Americans did, and they might even have had it coming. And I find that very disturbing, and I think now there's a similar undertone that says, if the Americans get into a nuclear confrontation, well, it's their own fault. I mean, they've been throwing their weight around the world. Of course, smaller countries are going to want to get nuclear weapons, despite our well-intentioned multilateral efforts to not do that. And therefore, this is really between the Americans and people that they've managed to aggravate out there in the world. To that, of course, there are two objections you can raise. One is, even if that were true, again, going back to Don's point, their aim isn't real good and their technology isn't real sharp. And, you can't, as somebody said yesterday, if we're roommates, it's not an apartment you can move out of. And so there's a very pragmatic issue here of missile defense involved. But I also think that it's not true. I do think that when I think of the enemies of the United States, I think in broader terms of the enemies of the West. I think of people that hate freedom, hate secularism, hate tolerance, hate democracy. And I don't think to Osama or to a rogue state, of which there unfortunately are more than a few, I don't think that Americans and Canadians look all that different, despite our deep belief that we are so deeply different. I think it's instructive to remember that the Soviet Union's think tank on North America, the most important foreign policy think tank on this subject, was called the Institute of the USA and Canada. To them, we were a combined research problem, and that made a lot of sense. I think also this reassuring mantra of "it's not about us" is comforting, but again, it's wrong. In part because of geography, but also because of alliance issues. I mean, if we are attacked, one would imagine that NATO will have to fulfill its obligations to respond to an attack. Can't simply just say, well, we didn't really want to be involved in this, but now that Seattle's been incinerated, well, maybe we'll think about opening up the skies here. I think that there are people who sincerely believe that this is exposing them to risk to be involved in this kind of project with the United States, and it worries me that they have adopted that mindset. I don't know how many people in Canada, a lot of what I'm saying is very impressionistic. I don't know how many people in Canada believe that. It just seems to me that that's a current public opinion that I find concerning. The second issue that seems to crop up is a deep Canadian anxiety about sovereignty, a word that keeps coming up here over and over and over again. And there's the tone of it, at least in some of the public comment that I've seen, I mean, it almost gets hysterical, as though the Americans are now going to control the very air we breathe. You know, that when we look in the sky, we're going to see the Star-Spangled Banner, sort of patrolling back and forth. I think, again, it reflects a fear, and I find this interesting. It's a fear that the Americans are twisting Canada's arm to give up control over its own destiny, to give up the very skies over Canada's mountains. This is demonstrably false, of course. I mean, there's been no evident pressure from the Americans at all. Again, this is an issue that is not. If you went to the average American and said the Canadians really don't want to get involved in missile defense, again, the answer you get is, don't we have a missile defense? And I just don't. It just doesn't gain a lot. So, in sum, I think that the technical issues of how Canada would become involved in national missile defense are fairly important, but those are workable. They can be worked out by specialists. I'm concerned more about the public anxieties in Canada that speak to a larger issue, a larger problem, a weakening of the relationship that may be pointing to a divergence of values, again, the kind that Lloyd Axworthy mentioned yesterday. Personally, I hope that's not the case. I think this should have been a relatively easy decision for the Canadian public, but I do think that the debate about this, that isn't happening here, but that does seem to be happening north of the border, could be one of the canaries in the coal mine that suggests that there might be more divergence ahead in the relationship. Although, again, I firmly hope not. Thank you.
Okay, we have about a half an hour before our humanitarian relief operation and before lunch. So let's open it up, and I'm going to use the prerogative of the chair to ask Dr. Polanyi the first question, but then I will recognize hands from the floor. And that is asking him to speculate on the reaction from the Canadian public when President Kerry essentially continues the missile defense deployment scheme more or less on the scale that President Bush has laid out. And I wonder what would happen to the dynamics at that time.
Am I supposed to use this?
Yes, please.
Yes. Well, forgive me, Mr. Chairman, but you put me in a false position by asking me to respond to a premise with which I don't agree. I would have thought that it's undeniable that the present administration has embraced missile defense more warmly than the previous administration, and so why should I accept that President Kerry would embrace it as warmly as President Bush? I don't accept that at all. I think what is at stake here is a worldview, and the reason that the present administration, which of course inherited a research and development program, went further and made a promise that by the time of the next US election in November of 2004, it would have a deployed missile defense. The reason it said that is because it saw armaments and the power of the United States as being the best protection that it could offer the people of this country. in a hazardous world. And the reason that there may be a holding back from agreement to join in missile defense in Canada is not, I would want to respond to Tom Nichols, it's not because Canadians are afraid that they might be a target, it's because their priorities are different and they don't believe that their future security is best served by being part of a gated community for the rich. They would like to put their resources elsewhere. And I just want to end by reminding people of something that probably nobody in the room, except perhaps Hugh Siegel, remembers, and that was a moment very early in debate about missile defense when the statement was made in the Canadian press, and it's very germane to what Tom Nichols was speculating about, that if US missiles were to intercept incoming, and at that time it was Soviet missiles, the debris might fall on Canada, including, of course, the nuclear warheads on the incoming Soviet missiles. And Mr. Trudeau got up and gave a speech which was characteristically rash for a senior politician, and I thought marvelously honest. He said, who the hell cares whether the debris, the nuclear debris, falls on Canada? The issue is, how do we prevent that sort of disaster from occurring? And he was absolutely right, and that is still the issue.
Well, I don't have a lot of debates with Nobel laureates, but I will bet you a case of Carolina Pale Ale that if President Kerry is elected, that the missile defense posture of the United States will look a lot closer to the Bush policy than it will look to the Canadian government's policy, even under President Kerry. Yes, and then a piece of that bet. No, I don't get many bets like this. Joel is next.
Quick comment about your, correct me if I'm wrong, that when the U.S., when they renamed the Institute of the USA in Canada, it was at a time when they suddenly realized that Canada might be different, and maybe during the Trudeau period. But my question has to do with cruise missiles. Are they, do you consider them a greater threat, more likely threat for a terrorist to get a hold of a cruise missile, put it on something Navy's looking at, put it on a container ship or a merchant ship, than a ballistic missile? And what's the status of cruise missile defense? And if there is no defense against the cruise, well, you know what the argument is, then why invest in defense against ballistic missiles?
Who were you asking? Me?
Yes.
No.
And Dr. Cook.
First of all, I think it's always been a fallacy to say that because you cannot defend against everything, that you should therefore defend against nothing. Yeah, cruise missile, if somebody gets hold of a cruise missile, that'll be a hard thing to defend against, but that doesn't mean that you don't do the thing you can do as well. I mean, I could fall down the stairs in my house. That doesn't mean I therefore don't buckle the seatbelt in my car. So that's the first point. The second is, there's something about ballistic missiles that I would argue is different, because they come into play during crisis, and they have coercive capacity to them that other means don't, because they're uncertain. I mean, think of it this way. Imagine that, you know, we're in some kind of a crisis with Fredonia. I mean, let's just, and by the way, there were several U.S. congressmen who thought Fredonia existed some years ago. That was a Spy magazine published that one. It was a little disturbing. But we're in some kind of a crisis with Fredonia, and we know from national reconnaissance means that Fredonia has a ballistic missile field. There's no doubt about it, and it'll get here. And there's no way to stop them. And if the leader of Fredonia turns the key, it's bye-bye Boston, Washington, Philadelphia, New York, Miami. That's different than the leader of Fredonia saying, now, somewhere offshore, there's a boat, and it's got a cruise missile. I promise you, it really does. I'm not kidding. I'm not making this up. Well, one of two things happen. Either we think he's bluffing, which is a bad idea, or we look down at our shores within a range of a cruise missile and say, how many boats are there out there? It's sort of like the man with a briefcase scenario, which is the other one I hate. Well, why wouldn't they just put it in a briefcase? Because think of it, during a crisis, a leader, it's not very effective for an enemy leader to say, okay, a guy who may or may not have been caught with a bomb that may or may not still be working might or might not have managed to plant it correctly in a city that I can't tell you about, so back off. I mean, these are very uncertain means that don't come into play in a crisis, that can't be used with the same kind of coercive certainty that with the kinds of other means that you're talking about. With that said, are cruise missiles a threat? Yeah, putatively cruise missiles are a threat, but not being able to defend effectively against one thing doesn't mean that you therefore throw up your hands and you don't defend against anything.
I think what is involved here goes further. I mean, we have to make a calculation of the costs of defending ourselves. I mean, if we defend ourselves, for example, against the danger of stepping into a highway and we're surrounded by speeding cars on highways, we would have to spend huge sums of money, and we don't. We just try to train people, and our children too, not to step into those highways, because the resources can better be spent in other ways. And I think that we live in a world where if we spend in the sum that is now in prospect is something approaching $60 billion over the next 5 years to erect a very partially effective missile defense. There are people around the world who are going to tick off the things that we should have done with those $50 million. Perhaps 5% of that sum would be enough to save the lives of or at least prolong the lives of 3 million people threatened with AIDS in Africa. It doesn't have to be Fredonia, real countries. The 1% of that would be enough to come to the aid of some 750,000 people who at the moment are being ethnically cleansed in the Sudan. These crimes of omission will, in today's world, be noticed and will be held to our account and will increase, I mean, apart from our consciences, will increase our danger. And so that's the sort of calculation I think we should be making.
Can I have a dollar figure to that before we go on? Here, just a 2-second dollar figure.
50 billion, not 50
50,
million.
yeah, it's 50 billion, but I just want to remind people, $4 billion a year spent in the American economy on potato chips. $5.5 billion a year spent unsupervised by children under 17 on things like CDs. It's not a matter of this sort of zero-sum game film. We're either going to have missile defense or we're going to solve the world's problems. There's a lot of money in the economies of the developed world. It's just a matter of where we choose to spend it.
Hugh Siegel, IRPP Montreal. I wanted to ask a question of both Dr. Nichols and Dr. Polanyi, because it strikes me that the analysis that both of you apply to this question is sort of fundamental to the underlying premise. How do you both respond to the notion that we in North America are rich because others are poor? Or more importantly, other parts of the world are poor because we are rich? Part number one. Part number two, if America had a wholesale change in its foreign policy, supported a Palestinian state at the expense of the survival of the state of Israel, demilitarized, produced massive aid in financial development and investment around the world, huge 180-degree change, do either one of you think that the risk from non-state actors, terrorists and others, and the potential deployment of weapons of mass destruction against the United States would fundamentally diminish?
I don't know who should be the first. The answer is quite short. Yes, I certainly do. And I gather from the way in which the question is phrased that you think the risk would not be changed. And so, I mean, this, we have a very different world view. I think that, for example, the risks of getting killed today in Iraq reflect a rather sensitive judgment on the part of some people in Iraq as to how prepared the coalition forces, largely US forces, were to fulfill the promises with which they arrived, such as making life better and more secure. I think we do see a sensitivity there to our actions or our failures. And so to say on the whole world scene that if we were seen to be trying to save the lives of those people I referred to in Africa who are likely to die of AIDS, if we were seen to be going to the help of people who by the million are in danger and who we could at least attempt to help for quite modest sums of money, would that make any difference to their attitude to us and to the dangers from terrorists, for example? I firmly believe it would make a difference, but I gather you do not.
I'd like everybody to brace themselves for a shock that, I'm going to disagree with you for a moment. I know everybody's scribbling their notes. Oh no, I thought he was going to agree. First on the question of are we rich because others are poor, or others are poor because we're rich? I think, sure, I'll be the first to admit, as a big fan of capitalism, I think that unrestrained, unregulated capitalism can hurt people. There's no question about it. However, I think that mad socialist fantasies of central planning nightmares that have gone throughout the Eastern Bloc and the Third World have impoverished and killed far more people than capitalism ever will. We're still recovering from the ideological nightmare of the last half of the 20th century that broke people's spirits, destroyed their creative energies, impoverished their treasuries, incited famines, wars. I genuinely believe that. And one thing I would say in response to that first point is, if you want to fly, if you want to use computers to design advanced medicine to get to people in distant parts of the world to help them, then I hope that you are going to do it with an economy that is capable of producing Boeing, Microsoft, Pfizer, and other engines of unbelievable creativity that make human life better. You can't eat half that sandwich. You can't say that I want all of the advantages and all of the human advances represented by the Western way of life, called the Northern way of life, you want the developed world, and say that I don't. But on the other hand, I really don't want us to be wealthier. I don't want to reward entrepreneurs for inventing better drugs. I want to take away Bill Gates' money because nobody should be that rich. He shouldn't have invented Windows in the first place. That kind of stuff. I just don't think you can have one without the other. And if I have my choice of a life of egalitarian impoverishment under authoritarian regimes that have imposed crazy schemes of central planning, or a certain amount of social inequality and injustice in places that have clearly made human life better and furthered the range of human justice and advancement, then I will take the latter. Second, the question about a U.S. change in policy. For example, if we engaged in a completely immoral policy of deciding that the Israelis should be allowed to be pushed into the sea and subjected to perhaps a second genocide, if we denuclearized, demilitarized, threw up our hands and said, look, we're going to stay at home and all we're going to do is try and get out there and do good works and build gardens and the like. No, I don't think hardly anything would change at all. I think our allies might like us more because, of course, would then by default make them the most powerful people in the world. But I also think that you'd get some points from some of the countries in the world. So well, that's very nice, very humanitarian. I'm reminded of a off-the-reservation Soviet diplomat in the early days of the Cold War, where someone said to him, "Look, Stalin's making all these demands. What if we just acceded them? We got to avoid this conflict with this." And this went back to the people talking about legitimate Soviet interests, a phrase I can hardly ever speak. But what if we just gave in to these demands? What would happen? And he said, "I'll tell you what will happen: a fresh round of new demands." And I believe that would happen with most of our enemies in the world, our enemies, common Western enemies. I believe that if we gave them everything they wanted, then there would be another round. Remember that one of the first things in Osama bin Laden's declaration of war, he said, "Okay, America, listen up, we're at war. First thing, you must all convert to Islam." I have great respect for Islam. It doesn't happen to be my religion. I'm not converting anytime soon. So I don't think that you can get out of this. The lion and the lamb you know the old joke about the Soviet jail, or excuse me, the Soviet zoo, and probably in many other versions of this, but we've gotten the lion and the lamb to lie down together, and the visitor says, "That's incredible, how'd you do it?" He said, "New lamb every morning."
Well, let's get these, because it seems to me no accident that discussions about missile defense end up being theological discussions, because I think the positions often take that form. But you are next.
Judith Kelly from the Center Institute of Public Policy. There seem to me that there are two basic sources of disagreement about missile defense. One is the political desirability and one is the technological feasibility. And given that we have a range of opinions up here and that you are experts in this field, I assume that you have some opinion about both of those. Dr. Nichols, you made some suggestion of a minute of uncertainty and an hour of deliberation. Of course, that's not really the hard currency we're dealing in when trying to assess the technological feasibility. It's the probability of bringing down an incoming missile. So, I would like to ask Dr. Polanyi, as well as one of the advocates, at least one of the advocates of missile defense, to give me your estimate of the probability, the current probability of our technological ability to bring down an incoming missile, as well as a confidence range around that probability, so that we can assess at least one of the sources of your disagreement. Thank you very much.
These are, of course, contentious questions, and so I don't pretend to speak for Dr. Nichols on my right, but a really superb missile defense system would have a 50% success rate, and I don't think that anything at that level is contemplated, but some attenuation of the incoming strike is what is aimed at, and if one makes the optimistic assumption that the missile defense is 50% effective, in my view, the consequence is that the opponent, and the opponent at the moment is one who has, the opponent who is contemplated is one who has, let's say, 4 missiles, a rogue state, something like that, would increase the number of missiles from 4 by 50% to 6 missiles, thereby vitiating, if that's the word, the defense. And that's why I don't see it as a promising direction of development. The view was expressed, I think, by Tom Nichols that it would give pause. I think you quoted him. It would give pause to the attacker. But he also said that the attacker should be understood as being a madman or madwoman. And that being the case, I don't understand why it would give the attacker much pause. So that's my technical answer, and from the previous bout of discussion, which I found very important and very not irrelevant, that Hugh Siegel brought up, I was just going to ask people to consider whether, if they go the route that Tom Nichols and Mr. Siegel was going, whether they would then feel that the monies spent on foreign aid are really misguided, since there is no advantage to be gained by being seen to at least attempt to come to the help of others.
I think I was mischaracterized in that last sentence, John. I didn't say that it's pointless to come to the aid of others. I'm saying that putting foreign aid in opposition to missile defense, as though you must do one or the other, is a false choice. I think foreign aid is a good thing. I think you know, Western nations are charitable, decent nations, and they do try to help other people. But to say that somehow you must measure your own security against what you can do for other people, especially, like I said, when you spend $4 billion a year on potato chips, I think it's a false choice. As for the issue of deliberation and a madman, Even madmen have moments of prudence. I mean, you know, the kid that went shooting at cars in Ohio didn't go stand out in the open and say, catch me. And when they started looking for him, he ran away. You know, people who do bad things nonetheless can be induced, again, even if it's just a pause for an hour to think about the ramifications. The other thing about increasing missile size, the force, the size of the missile force, you know, that's just, you don't, especially if you're a poor, small country, you don't just snap your fingers and make that happen. That takes time. And again, you're buying time. If what they feel is that they can't execute a strike without building more missiles, and it's going to take them a lot more time and money to build more missiles, then you've built yourself some time to deal with them. I want to point out very briefly, we now have a lot of evidence about what happened in Moscow after Reagan announced the SDI policy, which was roundly criticized. You know, people said nobody could take it seriously. Turns out that the people who did take it seriously were actually the Soviets, and they took it very seriously. They took it incredibly seriously to the point of panicking the defense and scientific establishments because they didn't know if it could work. And no one knew. I mean, Reagan didn't know if it could work. I didn't know if it could work. But they started sitting down and saying, you know, if this thing can work at all, we got a problem on our hands. And that started that cycle of deliberation. And in fact, it made them make choices about maybe we have to build more weapons, maybe we have to stretch our economy to the breaking point. All things that I think were very positive. And I think historically the role of SDI is now being shown to have had a very positive effect on the end of the Cold War. Now, I don't know if that'll be the effect with a small proliferator or a rogue state, but considering that we've done this once and are now getting some results in on the effect, I think that's encouraging.
We have 4 more people on the speakers list, and I don't know you all, so I've identified you sort of by color of dress and whatnot. And you are next. But before you ask your question, I was wondering if we could get the premier to come and deliver an opinion on some of the discussion that we've just had, because it strikes me that you, of all the people on the panel, are the most well poised to answer. Not on the technical feasibility of the system, not that question, but the larger questions that were raised.
Well, I think it's quite premature to ask me. I don't know what they're talking about, frankly. I don't know the overall extent of the implications on Nunavut. So I'll wait and see, and see how far it goes.
Alan Sommerfeld. I come out of the missile defense community, technology and development. I'm currently an advisor to Northern Command as a missile defense advisor. And a recovering lawyer, not just a lawyer. So it's interesting to hear the academic discussion, the legal discussion without the technology base. You know, Reagan and Star Wars, something in space, lasers, chemical lasers, things like that, but that's not what the missile defense system is about today. The missile defense system is a hit-to-kill vehicle. Incoming missile 7 kilometers per second, outgoing interceptor 3.5 kilometers per second, 10 kilometers per second collision in space, totally atomizing everything. We're not going to have debris. I mean, if we miss, then it's going to hit somewhere in the United States or Canada. But if we hit, it's going to just totally atomize the stuff. So it's too bad that we don't have a little bit of technology background, because people are using the old Star Wars thoughts instead of the current technology. And it's going to be much more effective than 50%. So it's too bad that we don't have a little bit of a framework of stuff. And the idea that there's GPS in the target vehicle, and so therefore, here I am, hit me. That wasn't the reason the GPS was there. The interceptor doesn't see that. But that's so that we can make sure we have a good test. But can we prove that? No. You have to trust the people who are developing the system. But with that in mind, let's go back to the ABM Treaty. It was a mutual treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union, 2 parties, and yet we have Canada that says that's the cornerstone of world peace. And so we have all these other countries that say the ABM Treaty had to be there. They weren't even parties to the treaty. Now we've come along and we've developed, you know, the arms control regime is good, but you have to have people that believe in arms control to make the arms control regime work. So I guess my question is, can Canada focus on what the technology is in their public debate, or will Canada be captured by the old Star Wars thing, and will the truth, as we say in missile defense community, missile defense agency, will the public facts be, will the facts be out there, or will it be a emotional debate based upon non-truths?
That's called a push poll. But did you want to respond to that?
Well, I'm really quite well aware of what the technology is, and I find it a bit offensive to suggest that I'm decades out of date in my knowledge of it. And I don't understand really what the point of the comment is. I mean, the number of tests now has dwindled to almost none, and the system, which is certainly not ready for deployment, is being hastened into deployment. This is not about Star Wars, it's about the present deployment. And I would just perhaps rather quote the recent statement by 49 retired US generals and admirals who are saying the same thing about the present system that I have been saying, that it is not ready to be deployed. And they go further than that. They say it's a poor use of scarce defense dollars, and they ask that it be postponed and reconsidered. I don't think one can dismiss that as being the work of a bunch of out-of-date dreamers. This is a statement of these 49 generals, which was issued about 10 days ago.
Just a very quick comment. You asked the question about how Canadians are going to get involved. I think that the key thing is that getting the information to the Canadian public is an issue in itself. I don't think that the Canadian public are well informed in terms of being able to make a decision collectively. When there are comments with regard to, for example, retired generals and the like, this does muddy the water. My perception or my concern is that we have to be aware, you come from the R&D community, we have to be aware that research and development is carrying on. As John has said, he's not against research and development, nor am I. But the key thing is that this is currently being taken as a snapshot in time, as opposed to the fact that there is an ongoing research program, and that this is not going to be the only capability the way it is at the moment. It is going to be carrying on. If someone says it's not going to work, well, just down the way here, when Orville Wright flew a few hundred feet, did somebody say this is not going to work? So I think that we have to invest some intellectual effort in understanding that this is a research in progress activity, and the deployment at this particular time is the best available, but that doesn't mean it'll be the end point.
I want to press the Premier again on a question, because I didn't frame the question well the first time. But my question is, a often heard critique of missile defense is the one that you heard John Polanyi make, which is we're proposing to spend an incredible amount of money on a system that even the experts say would be not 100% effective against only one slice of the threat. And it is the kind of defense decision that only an exceptionally wealthy and self-absorbed country would consider doing. And if you're trying to promote a more stable world, you could spend that money more wisely. That, from your perspective, you have a unique perspective on this panel. I was wondering if that argument resonates with you. Is this the kind of wasteful spending that that the U.S. would be well advised to avoid, and instead shift the money to a different to resource other aspects of its foreign policy? Do you buy that argument?
Well, as I said, there are some legacies of American investment in Nunavut that we're benefiting from. That Americans continue to come and spend their money. We appreciate that as a young territory that's trying to find ways of generating That's why we'd love to be involved if there's any discussions, so that we can find out how we can benefit from such activity. So we remain open. The other levies that were left behind, like environmental contamination, we do not want to see that again. So we would like to take part and see how we can work together.
Okay, in the back.
Mercedes Stevenson, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. We've heard a lot about the physics behind the system today and the command structures, but no one really seems to get into the intricacies. And one of the criticisms we hear is that the system doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because there's a problem on the kill vehicle as far as being able to distinguish the infrared heat signature that's coming off a target, which means basically you can put a heat source inside of a balloon and in space it can move at the same space as a warhead would. But it's also a problem that can be fixed. So it's not something that you can't develop. From a Canadian perspective, we hear a lot of disinformation about this is Star Wars, this is a space-based system, this is a weaponization of space. Well, in terms of weaponization of space, Central Command uses satellites every day to target bombs, to watch its enemies. We already use many of the satellites in space for military purposes. So you get a real crossover. But my greater concern is about what Don was talking about, that's Canadian sovereignty. The logistics inside the command structure, regardless of whether or not the system works, are dependent on Canadians being able to be in charge of Americans and Americans in charge of Canadians. If you have a situation where ballistic missile defense goes to Strategic Command, where it goes to Northern Command instead of NORAD, and those same people are using the same screens in the Operational Command Center in Cheyenne Mountain, and you now have subordinates who know more than their Canadian commanders, there becomes a real issue there for bilateral control. And if Canada can't monitor and control its own aerospace and is unwilling to increase the defense budget to create our own command to do so, I'm not sure why we don't see more of this in the Canadian media arguments as to that this is a sovereignty issue, not so much in participating and being subjugated to Americans, but insofar as we'll lose our own ability to command and control our aerospace, which is a basic function of any sovereign nation. So I guess I'd put that mainly towards Don because he worked in the Canadian media a lot, but any of the other panelists as well.
I agree, and I don't know why the media don't pay more attention to this. I wrote an article on this subject in the fall of 1999, and shopped it around to several newspapers, and they came back and said, well, this was it was 820 words. They wanted it down to 750, so I got it down to 750, and then other things came along in the intervening time. 2 years later, a former student of mine who was an editor at the National Post phoned and said, would you mind if we published that article of yours on BMD? And I said, no, please go ahead. And the long and the short of it is that the Canadian newspapers don't seem to be interested in getting these kinds of articles that make these kinds of arguments. So I do not know the answer to your question, except that I do agree wholeheartedly that this is the level of discussion that has to be advanced in Canada.
Well, I'm not paying for this mic, and the guy who is has given me the high sign, so we will have to close it there. I think we reached a level of agreement on two issues, playing off on your last comment. We certainly need more funding for more research and for more publications. So in an academic setting, that's about as much consensus as we're likely to find. So with that, I will close this there.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks to the entire panel. We will be starting our lunch, for those of you joining us at lunch, sharply at 12:30 in the same room, about 3 doors down on your right. See you at 12:30.